Connor's shove looked like a careless jolt inside the polished downtown cafe until Grace, the composed young CEO, slowly turned and fixed her sharp eyes on the entire scene. Mason did not curse. He did not raise his voice. He simply set his coffee down and looked straight at the man who had humiliated him. Nobody in that room knew the quiet single father had once pulled an entire special operations team out of a mission gone wrong. And when Connor lifted his hand to strike again, Mason spoke one calm sentence that froze the whole cafe where it stood. If you love a cold, deeply satisfying reversal of fortune, stay and follow this story to its final quiet line. Briar and Oak sat on a quiet corner in downtown Chicago, the kind of cafe where the espresso machines gleamed like jewelry and the napkins were folded with surgical precision. On that particular afternoon, the back room had been cleared for a private meeting between Grace Langford and a handful of senior managers from her company, Langford Systems. Grace arrived first, as she always did, moving through the room with the kind of quiet authority that made people straighten their posture without being asked. She was young for a chief executive, sharp-eyed and famously allergic to chaos of any kind, the sort of woman who could silence an argument with a single raised eyebrow. Connor Vale walked in just behind her, already talking, already performing the role of the most important person in the building. He greeted the staff with a tone that hovered somewhere between charm and condescension, the kind of warmth that evaporated the moment someone failed to serve him fast enough. He treated the servers like furniture that occasionally needed correcting, and he treated ordinary customers as obstacles between himself and his coffee. He moved through the room the way certain men move through every room, certain that the air itself would rearrange to accommodate him. Near the window, almost invisible against the soft light, sat Mason Carter. He wore a faded work jacket, the kind with a logo half worn away from years of washing, and his boots carried the dust of a dozen other jobs that week. His hands were rough, his knuckles slightly scarred, and his face held the particular stillness of a man who had learned long ago that silence was safer than attention. He was not there for coffee. He had come at the request of David Brooks, the cafe's owner, to look at a backup electrical panel that had been flickering for weeks, a small, tedious task that had nothing to do with the important people filling the room around him. The narrator noted, gently but clearly, that Mason did not belong to the world of polished shoes and tailored coats that filled the rest of the room. His presence was utilitarian, almost apologetic, a man trying to do his job without drawing a single eye toward himself. He kept his movements small and economical, the way a person moves when they have spent years training themselves not to be noticed, not because he was ashamed, but because attention had never once brought him anything good. Connor noticed him anyway, the way certain people always notice anyone who seems lower on some invisible ladder they have built in their mind. He glanced at Mason's jacket, his boots, the toolbox resting near his feet, and made his judgment in less than 2 seconds, filing him away as background noise, a minor inconvenience not worth a second thought. It was the kind of careless dismissal that men like Connor made dozens of times a day without ever realizing how often it would eventually cost them. Grace, for her part, barely registered Mason at all in those first minutes. To her, he was simply a maintenance worker, unremarkable, the kind of background detail that exists in every busy room without asking to be seen. She was focused on the agenda in front of her, the quarterly numbers, the looming international contract that needed careful handling, the dozen small fires that always demanded a chief executive's attention before lunch. She had no reason yet to suspect that the quiet man by the window would matter to her at all, let alone change the shape of everything that followed. The room itself felt staged without anyone realizing it. The soft hum of espresso machines, the low murmur of expensive conversation, the faint clink of porcelain against polished wood. Underneath all of it ran a current of tension that nobody could name yet, the particular stillness that exists right before something breaks. Briar and Oak looked, for all the world, like a perfectly ordinary afternoon, the kind that fills 1,000 other afternoons in 1,000 other cities without anyone remembering a single detail of it. It was not. Connor spotted Mason crouched behind the service counter, checking wires inside the small panel David had asked him to fix. He straightened up immediately, as if he had discovered something scandalous, and asked loudly why a cheap repairman had been allowed anywhere near the room reserved for important people. His voice carried on purpose, pitched just high enough to reach every table in the back section, the way a man performs outrage for an audience rather than feeling it for himself. David hurried over and tried to explain that Mason had helped the cafe many times before, that he was reliable and discreet, and had never once caused trouble. Connor cut him off before he finished his second sentence, waving a hand as though swatting away an insect. He turned the moment into theater, making sure Grace and the other managers could hear every word, twisting an ordinary repair job into something worth mocking, savoring the small surge of power that came from having an audience watch him belittle someone weaker. Mason did not raise his voice. He said simply that he would finish his work and leave, once he confirmed the panel was safe. There was no defiance in his tone, only a flat, practical calm, the kind that comes from years of being underestimated and choosing not to fight every battle offered to him. He had learned, long before that afternoon, that some men only wanted a reaction, and that giving them one only fed whatever hunger drove their cruelty in the first place. That calm only irritated Connor further. A man who refused to be afraid was, in Connor's mind, a man who needed to be put in his place. He sneered and asked whether Mason's children were proud of a father who spent his life crawling under tables for spare change, a remark meant to wound rather than to inform, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had never once worried about how his words might land. For one brief second, something tightened behind Mason's eyes when his family was mentioned, a flicker that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He did not answer the jab. He simply continued tightening a loose connection, refusing to give Connor the reaction he was hunting for, his jaw set in the particular stillness of a man holding something heavy without letting it show on his face. Grace, watching from a few feet away, noticed that flicker too. Something about Mason's stillness did not match the posture of a man who was simply afraid. It looked instead like restraint, like a held breath rather than surrender, and for the first time that afternoon she found her attention drifting away from her agenda and toward the quiet man by the counter. A few junior managers laughed along with Connor, the easy laughter of people following the loudest voice in the room rather than thinking for themselves, and the social pressure in the air thickened until it felt almost physical. Mason set his tools down with deliberate gentleness, the opposite of how an angry man would move, and said quietly that he had no interest in causing a scene. Connor, mistaking restraint for weakness, decided he had won already, and that mistake would cost him everything that followed, though he had no way of knowing it yet as he stood there, smug and satisfied, certain that the matter had been settled in his favor. Connor stepped closer, deliberately blocking the narrow path between the counter and the door, his shoulders squared in a way meant to look imposing rather than simply tall. He demanded that Mason apologize to Grace for ruining the mood of an important meeting, as though merely existing near her table counted as an offense worth punishing, his voice rising into the particular register men use when they want witnesses more than they want resolution. Mason refused, his voice even and unhurried, pointing out that he had not insulted anyone in the room. That refusal struck Connor like a slap he had not expected, and his face flushed with the particular anger of a man who has never once been told no by someone he considers beneath him. Without thinking it through, he shoved Mason hard with both hands, right there in front of Grace and every manager seated at the long table, the sound of the impact sharp enough to cut through every other conversation in the cafe. Mason staggered one step backward but did not fall, and the coffee cup in his right hand never spilled a single drop. For a few seconds, several people in the cafe laughed, the nervous, performative laughter of a crowd that wanted to side with power without having to think too hard about who deserved it. The laughter died quickly once they noticed something strange. Mason was not shaken. He was not afraid. He was simply still, and that stillness unsettled the room far more than any shout could have. Grace stared directly at him, and something in her sharp mind clicked into place. The way he had absorbed the shove, the perfect balance, the total absence of panic, none of it matched an ordinary man caught off guard. She had seen trained operators move like that before, in security briefings and emergency drills, and Mason's body had reacted with the same exact precision, the muscle memory of someone whose training had long ago become instinct rather than thought. Mason set the cup down slowly on the nearest table, turned to face Connor fully, and let his gaze settle on him without anger and without fear. There was nothing theatrical in the gesture, nothing meant to impress the room. It was simply the unhurried movement of a man deciding, in that instant, exactly how much of himself he was willing to spend on the person standing in front of him. Connor, embarrassed by the silence spreading through the room, raised his hand again, ready for a second push meant to reclaim whatever authority he believed he had just lost. Mason spoke only 5 words, quiet enough that people had to lean in to hear them. "Do not touch me again." There was no threat in his volume, only in the certainty behind it, and the entire cafe seemed to hold its breath at once. Grace felt for the first time that day a small chill of genuine unease, the sense that the man being mocked was not the one in danger. Connor's hand trembled for half a second before it slowly began to lower, though his pride would not let him admit defeat just yet, and the silence stretched on heavy and unbroken, until it felt as though the entire cafe had become a single held breath waiting to see what happened next. Determined to prove he was not afraid, Connor reached out and grabbed Mason's collar with both fists, dragging him forward in a clumsy attempt to assert dominance in front of an audience that had stopped pretending not to watch. Mason simply rotated his wrist, a small economical motion, and the angle of the grip turned against Connor's own balance. Within a single second, Connor's knee buckled, and he dropped halfway to the floor, his fists still tangled uselessly in fabric that no longer mattered. There was no punch thrown, no dramatic blow, nothing that resembled a fight in the way most people imagine one. The entire exchange lasted only a few seconds, clean and precise, the kind of motion that looked almost gentle from a distance, the sort of control that comes only from years of repetition rather than raw instinct. The moment Connor stopped being a threat, Mason released him immediately, stepping back with his hands open at his sides, palms turned outward, a gesture that said clearly he had no further interest in escalating anything. The cafe fell into complete silence. Connor scrambled upright, his face burning with humiliation, and shouted that Mason had just assaulted him in front of witnesses, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of his own embarrassment. Mason answered without raising his voice, reminding the room calmly that the security cameras near the counter would show exactly who had thrown the first hand, a simple fact stated without malice, the way someone might mention the weather. Grace, composed even in the middle of chaos, ordered everyone to stay seated and asked David to pull up the footage immediately. Connor's confidence cracked slightly. He had assumed Grace would automatically take his side, and the realization that she might not sent a flicker of panic across his face, the first genuine fear he had shown all afternoon. The recording, played quietly on a small screen behind the counter, showed everything plainly. The mockery, the shove, and Mason's response, which had been nothing more than the minimum needed to stop being grabbed. Grace watched the footage twice, her expression growing colder with each replay, though her coldness was now aimed squarely at Connor rather than at the stranger in the work jacket. She replayed the moment of the shove a third time, slowly, studying the precise angle of Mason's recovery, the way his body had absorbed force without losing a single ounce of control. Mason made no attempt to gloat or demand an apology of his own. He simply gathered his tools, checked the panel one final time, and prepared to leave as though the entire incident had been nothing more than weather passing through, something to be noted and then forgotten rather than carried forward as a grudge. That restraint, more than anything else, deepened the question forming in Grace's mind. Who exactly was this man, and why did he carry himself like someone who had survived far worse than a shove in a coffee shop, and why did the answer suddenly feel more important than anything else on her schedule that day? Just as Mason reached the door, the cafe's lighting flickered and dimmed, the result of a junior staff member quietly switching off a secondary circuit earlier that day at Connor's request, simply because the exposed wiring near the counter had looked unsightly to him. Mason turned back without complaint and traced the fault within minutes, preventing a small surge from damaging the espresso equipment entirely, working with the same unhurried focus he had shown all afternoon, as though nothing unusual had happened in the last half hour at all. Grace watched him work with quiet, practiced efficiency, and it became obvious that his understanding of electrical and security systems went far beyond what an ordinary repairman would need to know. He diagnosed the fault almost instantly, isolating the correct breaker without testing the others first, the kind of certainty that comes only from deep familiarity rather than guesswork. Charlotte Reed, the company's internal counsel, had been seated near the back of the room during the entire confrontation, and something about the name Mason Carter tugged at a memory she could not immediately place, a small persistent itch at the edge of her thoughts. She excused herself, made a brief call, and returned with a folder she rarely brought to casual meetings, her expression unusually serious for someone normally so unflappable. Quietly, she told Grace that the name matched a security consultant who had once worked anonymously to help Langford Systems recover stolen data during a near disaster nearly 3 years earlier. Grace felt the floor shift slightly beneath her composure. That incident had saved the company from losing a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and she had never learned the identity of the person responsible, only that someone, somewhere, had quietly fixed a catastrophe before it could destroy years of careful work. When Grace asked Mason directly, he looked almost uncomfortable being recognized at all, his shoulders tightening in the particular way of a man who preferred to remain unseen. He said only that he had been hired to do a job, and that he preferred nobody know his name afterward, his voice flat and final, as though the matter were already closed in his own mind. There was no pride in the way he spoke, no attempt to leverage the revelation into anything resembling status or reward. Grace began to understand that beneath the worn jacket and the quiet manner was a history far larger than anyone in that cafe could have guessed. a private world he had clearly worked hard to keep separate from the ordinary rhythm of his days. She wondered, not for the first time that afternoon, how many other ordinary-looking people walked through her offices and her meetings carrying histories nobody had ever bothered to ask about. Connor, still humiliated and listening from a few feet away, caught only fragments of the conversation, enough to realize that his position in the company might be threatened by a man he had just tried to publicly destroy. The realization curdled quickly into something uglier than embarrassment, a cold, calculating fear that began rearranging itself into a plan before he had even left the cafe. Rather than retreat and reconsider his behavior, Connor decided instead to rewrite the story in his own favor, painting Mason as a dangerous outsider who had deliberately positioned himself near the chief executive with intent rather than coincidence. It was a small, cowardly decision, the kind that would unravel everything he had built far faster than any shove ever could, though he had no way of seeing that yet through the haze of his own wounded pride. That evening, Connor made several quiet calls to contacts inside the company's internal communications team, the kind of favors people owe a man who has approved their bonuses for years. He spread a version of events in which Mason had violently attacked a senior executive without provocation, conveniently leaving out the part where he had thrown the first hand himself, smoothing over the details with the easy confidence of a man who had never once been caught lying before. He pressured David to sign a statement claiming Mason had caused a disturbance inside the cafe, hinting that refusal might cost Breyer and Oak its catering arrangement with Langford Systems entirely. David refused outright, his loyalty to Mason far stronger than his fear of losing business, even as Connor's threats grew sharper and more specific, listing exact figures and exact contracts that could vanish with a single phone call. Word of the rumors eventually reached Grace, fragments distorted just enough to sound plausible if she had not witnessed the truth with her own eyes. Rather than accept Connor's version automatically, she chose instead to investigate quietly, pulling additional footage and speaking directly with staff who had been present that afternoon, cross-checking every detail against what she had personally seen unfold in front of her. Mason, meanwhile, returned to his small workshop on the edge of the city, uninterested in lawsuits or revenge, wanting only to be left alone to continue his ordinary life. The narrator noted that he lived with deliberate discipline, speaking little, accepting only enough work to keep his small household steady, never reaching for more than he needed, content with a quiet existence most people would have considered far too small for a man of his evident skill. His child was mentioned only once, briefly, in a single quiet thought, that he needed his work to remain stable for the sake of the small family depending on him. Nothing more was said about it, and the moment passed as quickly as it had arrived, tucked away behind the same careful stillness he carried everywhere else. Connor escalated further, filing a formal complaint with the board of directors, demanding that Grace sever every connection to Mason immediately and treat him as a liability before he could cause any further damage to the company's reputation. Grace read the complaint twice, noting how carefully it avoided mentioning the footage that contradicted every claim inside it, the conspicuous absence telling her more than anything Connor had actually written. She realized, with growing clarity, that Connor was not merely arrogant. He was dangerous in the particular way that desperate, cornered men become dangerous, willing to bend facts and threaten livelihoods simply to protect his own position, and willing, it seemed, to keep escalating until something finally broke in his favor. She thought back to the footage from the cafe, the easy cruelty in his voice, and wondered how long he had been allowed to behave that way without anyone in the company ever truly stopping him. Rather than respond through memos or formal letters, she made a direct decision. She invited Mason to the Langford Systems headquarters so the entire matter could be settled in the open, with evidence rather than rumor deciding the outcome once and for all. Mason walked into the Langford Systems building beneath the visible contempt of several managers who had already decided, based on Connor's version of events, that he was the villain of the story. Heads turned as he crossed the lobby, the same faded jacket and worn boots drawing stares from people dressed for a far more polished world, though Mason kept his eyes forward and his pace steady, refusing to let their judgments slow him down. Connor tried immediately to turn the gathering into something resembling a trial, speaking with theatrical urgency about safety and liability and the dangers of allowing unstable strangers near company leadership. He paced the front of the room as he spoke, gesturing toward Mason as though presenting evidence at a courtroom rather than simply repeating accusations nobody had yet verified. Grace remained deliberately neutral, insisting that every claim be supported by clear evidence rather than tone or volume. Connor presented his case first, describing Mason as a man with violent tendencies who had no business standing anywhere near a chief executive, his voice rising with rehearsed outrage, each sentence polished from a night spent rehearsing exactly how to frame the story in his own favor. Charlotte played the full Café recording on the main screen, every second of it, including the mockery, the shove, and Connor's own lie about being attacked first. The room watched in uncomfortable silence as the footage exposed exactly what kind of man had been making the accusations, several managers shifting uneasily in their seats as their earlier assumptions crumbled in real time. Connor tried weakly to argue that Mason's calm, controlled response proved he was trained and therefore dangerous, a desperate twist that convinced almost nobody in the room. His voice cracked slightly on the word dangerous, the first sign that even he no longer fully believed what he was saying. Grace turned to Mason and asked plainly how he had learned to subdue someone without causing real injury. He hesitated, clearly reluctant, before saying quietly that he had once served in a specialized military unit handling missions most people would never hear about. On a video call arranged earlier that morning, Joseph Harris, his former commanding officer, confirmed the claim without hesitation, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who had spent decades giving orders that mattered. Joseph explained that Mason had once saved several members of his unit during a mission that collapsed because of betrayal higher up the chain of command. Mason had not left the service in disgrace, as Connor had implied through careless insinuation, but because he had taken responsibility that was never truly his, shielding the people who depended on him at great personal cost, a sacrifice nobody in that boardroom had ever asked him to make, and one he had never once mentioned to anyone since. Grace listened with a growing quiet respect that had nothing to do with curiosity anymore, and everything to do with genuine admiration, the kind that settles slowly and permanently rather than arriving all at once. Connor sat very still, the color draining slowly from his face as he understood, perhaps for the first time, exactly how badly he had misjudged the man he had tried to humiliate for sport, the full weight of his mistake finally landing somewhere he could no longer pretend to ignore. In the middle of the meeting, an alarm cut through the room as the building's security system flagged an active intrusion into the company's network. A coordinated group was attempting to lock down the contract data needed for an international signing scheduled within hours, threatening to derail months of negotiation in a single. Screens around the room began flashing red, technicians shouting numbers and codes at each other in the particular controlled panic of people watching a disaster unfold in real time. Connor, technically responsible for operations, froze completely, unable to offer anything useful as engineers scrambled around him. He fumbled with his phone, dialing numbers that led nowhere useful, his earlier bravado evaporating entirely under the pressure of an emergency he had no idea how to handle. Grace faced the very real possibility of losing the largest contract of the year, her composed expression cracking slightly under the weight of how fast everything was unraveling. Mason studied the screens for only a moment before recognizing the pattern of the attack, the particular rhythm of intrusion he had seen before in a very different context, years earlier, in circumstances far more dangerous than a boardroom. He said calmly that this was not random, that someone inside the building had likely opened a path for the attackers to walk through unnoticed, his tone carrying the same unhurried authority it had carried in the cafe. Connor's panic looked convincing on the surface, though something in his posture seemed performative rather than genuine, a detail that Mason noted immediately even as the room around them spiraled. Mason requested temporary access to isolate a secondary server before the breach spread further, and several board members hesitated, still wary of trusting him so soon after the accusations that had filled the morning. Grace made the call instantly, choosing to trust the man whose calm had already proven itself once that day, her decision final and immediate, with no room left for second guessing. Working alongside the technical team, Mason moved methodically, sealing off pathways one at a time without wasting a single unnecessary motion, his fingers moving across the keyboard with the same precision he had shown earlier when handling Connor's grip. The younger engineers around him fell into an easy rhythm, following his instructions without question, recognizing competence the moment they saw it, regardless of what he was wearing. He soon discovered that an internal account belonging to Connor had been used to disable a critical layer of security only minutes before the intrusion began, the timestamp glowing plainly on the screen for everyone in the room to see. Connor insisted immediately that his account credentials must have been stolen, his voice climbing towards something close to desperation, the kind of panic that comes when a carefully built lie suddenly has nowhere left to hide. Mason pointed out, without raising his own voice at all, that the access logs placed the activity at the exact moment Connor had been alone in his private office, a coincidence far too precise to be accidental. The mood in the room shifted entirely, suspicion sliding away from the quiet repairman and settling, heavily and finally, onto the man who had spent the entire day trying to destroy him, the silence that followed thick with the slow dawning recognition of exactly what had been happening all along. Cornered by evidence he could no longer twist or explain away, Connor's composure finally shattered completely. In a half-coherent confession, he admitted that Grace had always overlooked him for promotions he believed he deserved, and that resentment had curdled, over time, into a willingness to sell sensitive company data to a rival firm willing to pay for it, the words spilling out faster than he seemed able to control, as though some pressure that had been building for years had finally found its release. Nobody in the room moved. Nobody interrupted him. They simply listened as the carefully constructed image he had spent years building came apart in real time. He spat that Mason was nothing more than a lucky poor stranger who had no right to be trusted over someone with his title and history at the company. The insult landed flatly in the room, drawing no support from anyone, not even the managers who had laughed along with him back at the cafe only days earlier. Driven by rage and humiliation in equal measure, Connor lunged toward the desk, attempting to grab the drive containing the evidence against him before anyone could stop him, his chair clattering backward as he moved. Mason intercepted him calmly. Using only the minimum force necessary to pin his arm without causing any serious injury, the same careful restraint he had shown back in the cafe. This time, every person in the boardroom witnessed clearly who the truly dangerous man in the room had been all along, the contrast between the two of them now impossible to mistake or excuse away. Grace ordered security and the police to be called immediately, her voice steady despite the chaos still settling around her, every word measured and clear even as the room buzzed with the aftershock of what had just happened. Connor was escorted out in disgrace, his earlier confidence replaced entirely by a hollow, furious silence, his shoulders sagging under the weight of consequences he had brought entirely upon himself. Before disappearing through the doorway, he turned and hissed that Mason was nothing. A man without status or position worth respecting, the last desperate swing of someone who had nothing left to lose by saying it. Mason answered quietly that status had never once decided a person's worth, and that some people simply forgot that fact the moment they were handed a little power. The sentence landed in the boardroom with the same heavy stillness that had once filled the cafe after his very first warning to Connor, a silence that seemed to settle into every corner of the room and stay there. Grace understood, watching him stand there unmoved by the insult thrown at him, that Mason never needed noise to win an argument. He simply waited until the truth did the work for him, every single time, patient in a way that made everyone around him feel, just slightly, the weight of their own impatience. Once the chaos settled, Grace stood in front of the remaining staff and apologized openly to Mason for allowing Connor's behavior to go unchecked for far too long inside her own company. Her voice carried none of the polished distance executives usually reserve for public statements. This was plain, direct, and clearly meant only for him. She apologized as well to David, acknowledging that his small cafe had been pulled into a corporate conflict that had nothing to do with him or his staff, and promising that no further harm would come to his business because of it. She severed every contract tied to Connor's allies and quietly ensured that Briar and Oak would face no consequences whatsoever from the entire incident, following through within days rather than letting the promise drift into something forgotten. The board, eager to retain someone with Mason's evident skill, offered him a prominent leadership role overseeing the company's security systems, complete with a title and a great deal of public attention, the kind of offer most people would have accepted without a second thought. Mason declined the more dramatic version of that offer almost immediately. He explained, without bitterness, that he had no interest in becoming a story passed around the company, a symbol people pointed at rather than a person they simply worked alongside, a fate he had spent years carefully avoiding ever since leaving the service. Grace did not push him towards something he clearly did not want, recognizing in his refusal the same quiet integrity that had impressed her from the very beginning. Instead, she offered something far more practical, a position as an independent consultant, flexible hours, control over his own schedule, and no requirement to appear in any public capacity at all. Mason considered the offer carefully, recognizing that it offered him the stability his small household needed without forcing him to sacrifice the quiet life he had worked so hard to build, a balance he had rarely been given the chance to find anywhere else. Grace, for her part, no longer viewed him as someone she owed a debt to, but as an equal whose judgment she had come to genuinely respect, A shift in perspective that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with character. She found herself, more than once in the days that followed, replaying the calm of his voice in that boardroom, the way he had never once raised it even when everyone around him had lost their footing entirely. Whatever connection was forming between them began there, in that careful, unhurried space built on respect rather than urgency or spectacle, the kind of foundation neither of them was willing to rush. Neither of them rushed toward anything resembling romance. They simply allowed the foundation to settle first, the way solid things always need time, before they can hold real weight, content for now to let the relationship grow at its own steady pace, rather than forcing it into something neither of them was ready for yet. Several weeks later, Grace returned to Briar and Oak, this time without an entourage of arrogant managers trailing behind her, simply herself, dressed plainly, carrying none of the performance that had once accompanied her arrival. Mason was already there, checking the new electrical system David had asked him to install, his presence no longer something anyone in the room treated as invisible or beneath notice. He looked up when the door opened, recognized her immediately, and offered a small, easy nod that needed no further explanation. The atmosphere inside the cafe felt entirely different now. The staff greeted Mason with quiet respect rather than indifference, and regular customers who recognized him from the rumors that had spread weeks earlier offered only small nods, nothing loud, nothing performative, the kind of acknowledgement that respects a person without making a spectacle of them. David had placed a small, unobtrusive sign near the entrance reminding everyone to treat each customer with basic decency, careful never to mention a single name connected to the incident, letting the lesson speak for itself rather than turning it into gossip. Grace sat across from Mason and admitted quietly that on the day Connor pushed him, she had assumed she was simply witnessing an unpleasant disturbance, nothing more significant than that. She told him she understood now that the moment had revealed something far deeper, exposing exactly who each person in that room truly was beneath the surface they presented to the world, a truth that had taken far longer to surface than the few seconds it had actually taken to happen. Mason replied that he felt no particular pride in having silenced an entire cafe with a single sentence. His pride, he said, came from something quieter. The simple fact that he had refused to become anything resembling the man who had pushed him, that he had walked away from every provocation that day with his character intact rather than his temper proven. Grace smiled, softer now than the composed, guarded expression she usually wore in boardrooms and meetings, a warmth that seemed entirely unrehearsed. They talked a little longer about ordinary things, the new contract finally signed, David's plans to expand the cafe's seating, small details that belonged to a life moving forward rather than circling endlessly back to what had already happened. Neither of them mentioned Connor's name even once, as though the matter had already been settled completely and no longer deserved any further space in either of their thoughts. The story closed on a simple image. Mason seated at his familiar table near the window, drinking his coffee slowly, untroubled by the world moving around him. Nobody in the cafe laughed at him this time, not out of fear, but out of a quiet, hard-earned understanding. They had learned in the space of one ordinary afternoon that the stillness of a decent man can carry far more weight and far more warning than any threat ever could, and that some of the strongest people in any room are the ones who never raise their voice at all.